Welcome to the fair, everybody. All right, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Twila Dang, and this is a special NPR News in Focus at the State Fair. As you can probably hear, we are recording this live in front of real people. It's good to get out of the studio and be outdoors with you all today. And it's appropriate because the topic of today's In Focus discussion is how to overcome the so-called nature gap and make Minnesota's outdoors inclusive for all, because right now, it's not. So here's a few stats to get you thinking. According to the latest census data, about 20% of Minnesotans identify as people of color, but according to the Minnesota DNR study, people of color only make up about 5% of state park visitors. And here's another one. Research done by the U.S. Forest Service and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the Metropolitan Council between 2007 and 2016 show that visitors to the Minnesota outdoors tend to be white, above average income, male, and college degree holders. There's not much there to make people from traditionally marginalized communities feel welcome. But that's not where the story ends. There is an intentional work being done to counter that narrative. And today, I've got two outdoor equity advocates with me on stage to talk about how to make Minnesota's lakes, forests, prairies, and trails accessible to all. Anthony Taylor is a leading voice when it comes to connecting Black folks and communities of color to nature-based outdoor experiences and active living. He has led equitable outdoors efforts as Adventures Director for the Loppet Foundation and as the SVP Equity Outdoors for YMCA of the North. I'm sorry, that was a lot of letters. He continues this work to make Minnesota's green spaces welcoming and accessible to all through his work at the Met Council, the Cultural Wellness Center, and various other municipal, state, and community partners. Anthony, you wear many hats. Welcome to In Focus, and I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And also with us is Asha Shofner. Asha is an educator, an adventurer, a disruptor, an auntie, and the founder of Fusion Outdoors and BIPOC Outdoors Twin Cities Facebook group. Asha also works for the City of St. Paul as an environmental and outdoor education coordinator. Welcome, Asha.
Thank you.
Okay, so before we talk about how we solve this problem, let's do a little bit of table setting, so to speak. I'd like to hear from both of you, Anthony and Asha, about the lack of diversity when it comes to the outdoors. Give us your background, tell us your stories, and give us a little bit of statistical information if you have it. Let's start with you, Anthony.
Okay. Well, I feel like I've done this in different versions for a long time, and I think many people know me related to biking, and I think I started out really exploring bicycling, and I noticed there were not a lot of black cyclists, and this is the early days of my career with being outdoors, and it really has gone through many iterations since then related to outdoors, relative to camping or canoeing or snowboarding, skiing, all those different things. And most importantly, I think that what I found in Minnesota is that it's deeply connected to the culture. That there's really something about the culture here where people love outdoors. And so one, there's a lot of investment in it from a municipal perspective, from a state and regional and city perspective in terms of doing that. And what I also found is that communities of color were not benefiting from that. And that my challenge has always been that I want to eliminate our ability to predict disparities based on race, ethnicity, gender, or income. And unfortunately, what you described is that if we were sitting at the end of a mountain bike trail and you were going to get $1,000 to predict a fully covered mountain biker's race, what would you pick? If you were going to get paid another $1,000 to predict their gender, what would you pick? If you were going to get paid $1,000 to predict their income, you know what I mean? And so
I'd have a lot of money.
Right, you'd leave with that money. And that's our challenge, is that we can predict those outcomes. The challenge and opportunity for me was that those disparities also matched healthcare disparities, housing disparities, income disparities, educational disparities. So I immediately felt they weren't disconnected. So there was an opportunity for us to do something broader and working outdoors that is actually much more socially impactful.
I completely agree with you. Asha, tell us a little bit about your experience.
Sure. So I grew up in St. Paul as a transracial adoptee from India, and have been around white people in white spaces a lot, including in the outdoors. After George Floyd was killed in May of 2020, it became more apparent to me of being in community with people that look like me, and knowing that the outdoors is a space where, you know, COVID still exists, but it's less transmissible outdoors, and knowing the benefits of nature and spending time in nature is more so where it kind of, where my work and my passion expanded.
So I think I talked to you guys a little bit earlier. Beforehand, we got to do a little getting to know you. And one of the things I shared was there's a semi-deep irony of me being the person to host the session, because I am not the quote-unquote outdoor girl. I am the inside while everybody is out doing fun things. I watch the coats girl. So I'm really curious, and you both said such beautiful things about understanding what we consider like the definition of being out in nature is versus what it actually is. And Anthony, I want to definitely start with you, because you said the most wonderful thing about sort of how we view it and how it's sort of locked in. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, you know, I love that you use the word irony, because I think for us, what it actually means is opportunity, right?
Absolutely.
And I think, so that's the first thing, is that really optimism helps. But I think also the biggest thing is that I really want people to know that when we say outdoors, it doesn't mean that you have to go to Mount Denali, right? I mean, it is not the highest adventure that you could have. That really, what I really like to tell people is that outdoors, and I really think about it as outdoors, nature and adventure, right, are the best space for human development. It is the best space for being connected and finding yourself. And so really, it's presenting a different opportunity. So it's not me saying, you should go to Ely and spend a month in the Boundary Waters. That's not where we start, right? It is much more important for us to create an experience that happens outdoors. You create some small positive emotional connections to that experience, that are related to beauty or connectedness, or what matters to you, being closer to your children, loving your body. I mean, these, those things. And then what happens is we start a progression that takes you further and further away from that first step. But each one of those is really built on a positive experience. And so what happens is you wind up building some new excitement for it. And I think that's where we start off too far downstream, right? With my hardest experience is the least thing that anyone should ever try to start. That's crazy. And I think we do that over and over. And Minnesotans do that because they have a lifetime of it and take for granted, right, that their institutional knowledge is going to somehow give you an advantage, and it doesn't.
So, Asha, I'm going to point out that you made me feel infinitely better because I told you my definition of outside was to go stand on my deck. And I was like, I was on the deck, that's outside, or as close as I get to it. Can you share what you said to me and then elaborate?
Yeah, I said that counts as being outside, right? You are outside, and I think that to Anthony's point about, like, it's a progression, it is. It's when we start saying, like, oh, no, that's not outside, that doesn't count, that's not enough, right? Like, that wouldn't feel good, right?
Absolutely.
But if we can validate people's experiences of where they're at now, it might even just be opening a window, right? If you can't go outside because it's raining, but you can open a window and listen to the rain and feel the breeze, like, it's a stretch, but it still counts as outside, right? And it's those small moments that I think can then, if you really, like, soak into them and feel into them, then maybe the next time it's like, well, I'm gonna take a walk around the block, or I'm gonna eat dinner outside on the deck, or I might have a friend over to, it's just those small moments I think are really important too.
And they add up. They definitely add up. Mm-hmm. So I think I found myself, like a lot of people, using the outside as an alternative to being indoors, especially with the heavy COVID protocols, and especially early on in the pandemic. Do you think that the pandemic motivated people to go out in nature more?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think of Crosby Farm Regional Park in St. Paul, where I go pretty frequently. Mm-hmm. It's like in the winter even there were people down there, the parking lot would be full. And then on a nice day in the winter when it was, 36 degrees and sunny, there was parking up the hill. Everybody was trying to get out because that was, that's where folks could see each other. And there's a lot of folks that I know who didn't like the outdoors, but wanted like social connection, who now have kind of fell in love with the outdoors, right? And are doing a lot more things outdoors as a result of it. So in that way, I think the pandemic, like literally pushing people outside, I think it worked.
Well, what I will say is if the outdoor advocates knew all they had to do to get people to go outdoors was start a global pandemic, we would have had one every season, right? Because it absolutely did. Outdoors all of a sudden became the only safe space.
Yeah.
The only place we could get the thing we really want, which was human connection, right? And so it actually served, we were forced to experience the real reason we go outdoors. Like that's the part that outdoors isn't about the trip or about the vehicle. Is it a bike? Is it a canoe? No, it actually is about human connection. And that's what happened is we looked to outdoors for what we really go outdoors for, which is human connection and physical activity, right? And that ultimate sense of well-being. And I think that and the big thing with the pandemic that we will all point to is it focuses on our emotional well-being. Like it actually focused us on that, right? And so what we discovered or rediscovered is that outdoors with people is balancing. It is emotional supportive.
So let's talk a little bit about that outdoors and sort of how it fits in the larger spectrum of Minnesota. In 2020, the DNR and Explore Minnesota together created the Minnesota Outdoor Recreation Task Force, and they were trying to consider this particular problem. In the final report they released the group last year, there was a startling statistic. It's estimated that Minnesota is leaving more than $16 billion on the table because BIPOC communities and those with disabilities and other marginalized groups don't go outdoors. That's a lot of money for a state that leans heavily on outdoor recreation for its economy. Asha, you were on the task force. Is there anything you'd like to add to understand that statistic?
There's a lot of work to be done, and it has to be done in a way that doesn't feel tokenizing or exploitive, right, of BIPOC and marginalized communities. I think a big part of it is equipment, including clothing, right? Of like, if outdoor brands aren't making snow pants that will fit a pregnant person, for example, right? Like, how are you going to go outside and stay warm enough? To do something outdoors in the winter, right? So and folks with larger bodies, right? There's not a lot. It's changing, but there hasn't been a lot of like equipment for folks with larger bodies, and so it's unfortunate. It really sucks that that they're missing out, right? That folks are missing out, and that the outdoor recreation in Minnesota isn't. Like, it's not accessible for everybody for a number of reasons. And I think it takes a lot of, like, on-the-ground community work to help make and push for those changes.
Anthony?
Yeah, well, I think that the thing about the dollar amount and kind of the whole conversation, and again, a lot of people on task force is when you're working actually in historically marginalized communities, one of the strategies that I share is solve cost last. Right? Because what happens is that when you solve cost first, you actually further marginalize the communities because you think that you equate marginalization with poverty, right? And so what happens is then you leave out the real reasons people aren't participating are related to their emotional well-being, are related to the social experiences they've had, is based on the lived experience they've had that are making them make conscious decisions not to, right? So it's almost like and that's what's left out of the report for me, is that in some ways it doesn't really get down to those pieces of it. And I think that's where we are. I believe that communities of color, and I'll say my work specifically in the African American and African communities, those communities have significant resources that they're not investing in a choice to be in a park. Like it's not like they don't know the park. They're choosing not to go to the park. right? So our energy has to go into inspiring or enlisting and people to make those decisions on behalf of their family. Because that's what all my white friends love you, love Widgie, love Denord, love all the, they are choosing to be outside because they believe there's a long-term real benefit for the development of their children or their families or themselves. And we haven't answered that for marginalized communities. And in truth, they don't feel safe. They literally don't feel safe. And I think that's real. And until we acknowledge that, that's what it is. And again, you are our opportunity because you can choose to do whatever you want to do. You are you can choose whatever you want to do, and going to Portugal feels more feasible than going to Ely.
I mean, that's not a lie, but
No,
I understand. Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. But I mean, let's actually talk about that for just a second, because I think that's something that it sometimes gets lost in this conversation, the idea of what that feels like to have safety around your space and where you are. I think as people of color, we tend to have to be hypervigilant about our safety when we're in majority white spaces, and that so many of us have equated nature as a majority white space winds up leaving us, feeling like under the best intentions, like this just might not be for me. But I think sometimes majority audiences don't understand what that genuinely feels like when we say we don't feel safe in spaces where we're in the absolute numerical minority.
Yeah. Well, I do, and I will say that, and I love in Asha's introduction where she talked about being acclimated to white spaces, and I am acclimated to white spaces, and so one of the things I have to remember is that not everyone is, right? And there's an acclimation, there's a way you get used to it, and I think that outdoors has not been a safe space for Black people relative to being in places that are unregulated, that are private. And I think that it's really critical for people to, if you're not familiar with that, to really acknowledge that. And sometimes what I say to my white male friends who want to have this conversation is I go home and talk to a woman in your life who's ever just had to walk out of a parking lot. Right? There's a real consideration that you make based on vulnerability. And I believe that the historically marginalized communities, African American, Latinx communities, women, people who are living with disability, all of them have an increased level of vulnerability in these spaces that are unregulated and private, and majority white and majority male, and feel violent towards them. And it's really important to consider that as we design invitations and design experiences. And that's what I mean by handling money last, right? Because if you make it free, but all that's real, there's still not participation, and that's a real aspect of what it feels like. And in my own experience, I was on a camping trip with my daughter in Mount Hood, which is our friends from Oregon. It's a beautiful place. While we were gone, someone hung a noose in our campsite.
I'm so sorry that happened to you.
And I was too, because it immediately impacted my daughter in a real way. So what I'm doing now as a parent is managing that. Right? So now, and that's what we do as parents. We protect our children from potentially hazardous, emotionally hazardous experiences. And Black, brown, poor families, women, that all this is, we're managing that all the time. And so that's real. So we have to help increase the fact that people perceive those spaces as safer. We do have to come together. We have to go together. We have to create pathways that connect closer to home, so we're building skills. So we're not handling 50 things at once. Equipment, skills, the route, the challenge, all at one time. We've got to build progressive experiences relate to the emotional life that we're having outdoors as well.
Absolutely. Asha, we talked a little bit about some of the work that you do, especially with the BIPOC Facebook group and some of the trips you take. I think Anthony just really speaks to something that I think is really important for people like me that are starting to get into this, that we're not just sort of going in blind and we're not going in without support. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you do with your trips?
Yeah, sure. So we just came back on this past Sunday night from a Boundary Waters trip that was for LGBTQ folks. It wasn't a BIPOC-specific trip, but it was BIPOC-centered, and we had majority BIPOC participants. And so part of what safety looks like in that is, calling folks ahead of time to ask them, like, what are you looking forward to? What are you afraid of? Like, do you want to sleep in cot or do you want to sleep on the ground, right? What skills do you want to learn? What skills do you want to share? Just asking people a bunch of questions. Do you need anything from the packing list? Because we can, figure out a way to get it to you. We had a person who had never camped before for our BIPOC family camp a few weeks ago, and she was like, I think me and my daughter want to go, but I'm not sure, and we're probably going to cancel. And I was like, hey, like, let me just bring you a tent and some sleeping pads and, like, try it out, in the next day or two, and let me know how that went, because, like, we don't want you to come up to the Boundary Waters and be stuck, right, for 4 days. And she wasn't able to camp before kind of the deadline, but she called me and said, like, all right, we're going to do it. And I was like, really? She's like, yeah. She's like, you went out of your way, to make this tent and these 2 sleeping pads accessible for us. And so, like, we trust that you're going to take care of us, that you're going to be looking out for us when we go up to the Boundary Waters. And it was just, it was a cool experience that didn't follow the rules by the book, but is really about, like, meeting people where they are at to the best of our ability so that they can feel safe, so they can feel trusted and in good hands.
Well, that trust absolutely breeds safety. It makes people feel like they want to be connected.
Can I add one more thing to
Please.
that? Is that on both of these 2 trips that we've taken to the Boundary Waters, the participants have been, like, they've been active participants, right? Learning all of the same stuff that the guides are doing, so that they can do this on their own. Like, everybody learned how to, steer a boat from the back, right? Everybody, learned how to set up the cook stove and how to set up their tents. And so, because I think a big part of what is safety is being able to have the knowledge to know how to do this stuff and how to get out of hard situations. If you're trying to cross a lake that's super windy, right, but the different paddle strokes to be able to safely control your boat across it, or when to say, I think we're just going to stay here and have a snack and wait this out a little bit, right? Like, our participants got that knowledge, and we're able to share it with each other too, which I think can really strengthen what safety means.
If you're just joining us, this is In Focus, live at the Minnesota State Fair. And today we're talking about how to make Minnesota's outdoors more welcoming and accessible for traditionally marginalized communities. My guests are Asha Shofner, who herself is an adventurer, which has led her to start the BIPOC Outdoor Twin Cities Facebook group. She also works for the city of St. Paul as an environmental and outdoor education coordinator. And also with us is Anthony Taylor, who wears many hats when it comes to equity in the outdoors. I'm sorry, they're not gonna make me say all those letters again, so bless you. So, Anthony, I know you see a deeper story at play here, and we've been talking about that. And some of what gets overlooked is Black Minnesotans having their own history and legacy of being in the outdoors. Can you talk about that with us a little bit, and maybe start with the example of Lake Adney?
Yeah, there's a community near Bemidji. Lake Adney is actually a legacy African American area. So what happened is, starting as far back as in the late 40s, Black families began to buy property there. And many people in the community will know Mrs. Wilcox. Mrs. Wilcox actually owned an operating destination for families at Lake Adney into the 90s. And these families began to buy this. So this was St. Paul families, South Minneapolis families, that are still, and actually still own property there. So it was this enclave of African American Black families from what we know as a historical Rondo community, the near South Side, that were buying property there and camping, and those properties continue to be owned by their children to this day. And one of the pieces that I think in terms of legacy is also really interesting, Phyllis Wheatley, which was a settlement house that in North Minneapolis committed to actually immigrant African American communities to the Twin Cities. We don't often think of African Americans as immigrating, but they did. Continued owns. They opened a camp in 1957. And continue to own that. And they're actually right now in the throes of reopening this camp and really looking at it again as it was a space where African American families were using outdoors around youth development and well-being, and again, this idea of assimilation into the communities in the great northern city of Minneapolis. And so that's really exciting. It's an opportunity for us to have a culturally specific Black-owned camp that really will do that. And it's bigger than a camp because it is going to serve families, it's going to serve the community, but it is exciting for us to know that that's launching right now. And so we have a long legacy of being connected to outdoors.
That sounds amazing. There was a beautiful series on Twin Cities Public Television called America Outdoors with Baratunde Thurston. And in one of the episodes, Baratunde came here to Minnesota, to the Arrowhead region, to explore the wilderness and talk to the people who love it. And one of the people he talked to is an outdoor enthusiast and a birder, someone you know, named Dudley Edmondson. I want to play a short clip from that episode where Baratunde talks about access to the outdoors.
So I'm going to ask you a very direct question, Dudley.
Yes, sir.
Black people, where are they?
Yeah, they're not here. Yeah.
How did you adjust to that when you came here?
Yeah, you know, for me, I've always been a person who, my connection to nature is so strong that that's priority.
A few years ago, Dudley wrote a book about outdoor enthusiasts titled The Black and Brown Faces in America's Wild Places. It featured inspiring people of color who, like Dudley, have found solace and meaning in the outdoors.
I think that as people of color, we have been, I don't know, I'm going to use the word relegated to urban spaces, right? But I have found that in outdoor spaces, white people, for whatever reason, feel threatened. I know 2 African-American males this year who were fishing and were shot at several times in their boat. Someone shot at them as they were fishing multiple times.
So that's an extreme example.
It's an extreme example. I mean, myself, in this community, I have not had those kinds of things happen.
Yeah.
I have had them happen on camping trips where I've had people calling me the N-word. What I get in that green space is so helpful to me. I'm willing to take ownership for that space, and I might also be willing to challenge people who challenge me, because that space is so important to me, to my mental health.
So a lot of what Dudley shared there echoes some of the conversation we had before, but I think there's something that we're not hitting on that tends to be something that Minnesota knows increasingly, like incredibly well. There's a lot of microaggressions that happen here. Do microaggressions play themselves out a little bit differently when people are trying to engage in nature? Does the accessibility for marginalized people become even further challenged by sort of assumptions that are made about us or assumptions that are made about our capabilities?
Yes. Yeah, so the one that comes to mind that's the most recent is ahead of these Boundary Waters trips, I have some funding to get some technology to use while we're there. So I posted on the Boundary Waters Facebook page of like, I have a bunch of money to use for technology, well, as we're taking folks up north, you know, and I said, you know, I know a map and compass is really important, and we're gonna have those too, but I'm looking for other suggestions, right? And I just assumed the pushback would be like, you don't need technology, use a map and compass, right? But then people started commenting about, well, I didn't show my credentials or qualifications, and I'm like, yeah, I know, like, those are irrelevant. I'm just asking for technology, right? Technology recommendations. Somebody cussed me out on there. And, you know, it's just like, it's things that people don't, like, as other people are asking questions about technology, nobody is questioning their credentials or legitimacy of, you know, taking groups of folks up north, right? But when they see a brown person of color, right, or a brown woman of color, right, me, when they say me, they're like, oh, she can't do it, right? The assumption is made that I'm not qualified just by looking at me. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And that frustration is, I mean, that's a real everyday frustration for people of color here, but I can only imagine how it plays itself out when you're just trying to figure out how to engage outside. Anthony, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I do. I think that the idea of the microaggressions, I mean, the bottom line that is really difficult is, I think, because we see so few diverse people outdoors, there is this response we have that they might not belong here, right? And then what happens, sometimes even when you think you're being helpful, you begin to ask questions or engage around the idea of, one, this is new for you, you're on a program, who funded this? Are there, it's a whole line of questioning that is actually based on the experience of not being outside with diverse communities, and that happens, and I think that that really those things erode your confidence. They erode the potential positive experience you're having. And I think one of the things that especially when Dudley was talking, what has happened for him is that remember he said that outdoors nature, this experience matters so much to me. I understand the benefits so deeply that I am willing to endure that, and I'm willing to fight for it. So the opposite end of that is someone who's having it as a new experience, right? That hasn't had all those positive experiences built up. And so they don't have the piece that goes, okay, I'm gonna let this go so I can get to the good stuff, right? The good stuff is so great because I haven't experienced it yet, that I'm gonna endure, I'm gonna fight for this. And so that's where, again, I think that's why the work that, what Asha was describing just now, really important, because those early experiences, when we can create those early experiences where there's extreme safety, and we really let them bank those positive experiences and bank it and bank it and bank it, and then we create these culminating experiences over and over, what happens is then they gain what Dudley is describing, right? And that's our problem, is that time from I've never done it till I've banked enough positive experience to endure just stupidity, ignorance, racism, sexism, whatever it is, because I know the good stuff is so good, right? It takes time to get there, and that's what we're working on, right? Is that period of time. And I think, and I'd love for you to comment, Asha, too, because I do think the other thing that happens is intersectional work is even more. I mean, there's a whole nother level of work that you specialize in around intersectional spaces outdoors, and it's a whole nother level of work.
Yes. And I think, though, to jump back a little bit, and I think, Anthony, you and I both do a good job of this, of like, we're not just taking people outside, right? We're meeting people outside, and we're teaching them the skills to be able to do this on their own, right? We're helping provide a platform for them to build their confidence and their skills so that they can keep doing this, so they don't have to be part of a program, or they don't have to have come on scholarship or whatever. Like, because as you learn it, you start doing it, right? Like, I mean, I've seen this. I'm sure you've seen it too. Of like the folks that come do stuff with you in program, then all of a sudden, a couple of weeks later, you see like an Instagram post of them doing it without you, and you're like,
or
oh,
they call you and go, well, I called you last week. Where are you? I was in the Boundary Waters. Like, and we kind of go, by yourself? I mean, it's like it's an amazing feeling, right?
Cool. Yeah.
It's just that's an amazing feeling. Then when that happens,
So the two of you do such focused and dedicated work around this, and to get more of us that are part of marginalized communities out in nature. What is the role of allies? What can they be doing to help make the work that you do more sustainable, easier to do? I mean, what you do is a heavy lift. How can they help? How should they help?
My friend who lives across the alley, who's a white woman, asked me that same question this morning. She's like, what are you going to say when they ask you that? And I was like, well, tell your BIPOC friends about, BIPOC Outdoors Twin Cities, about Melanin and Emotion, about, other like BIPOC spaces that are really, really centered around the experiences and values of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Put some money out, right? Like, help fund some of these programs and initiatives. I have a personal plug for somebody to help us clean gear next Sunday when we come back from our trip, because it's a lot of work. I don't know. I think a lot of it is just like helping get the word out and trusting that like we will hold the people that come, and also putting pressure on other organizations where BIPOC families and mixed families, blended families, maybe don't feel safe or welcome, like putting pressure on them to say, hey, do better, right? You've had 100+ years of your camp, do better, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'll start with that. I think that's a really important one, is that the communities that you're connected to that love outdoors, see the benefit as part of developing their families, their communities, that they really do commit to make their resources available broadly for organizations and people that are actively bringing historically marginalized communities outside. I think the other thing that I think that I'm always pushing them to do is when you tell the story, I'm asking them to maybe tell the story less about and I think the adventurous experience, right? And much more about the benefit, much more about the emotional experiences that because I do think that they're not often clear that the real reason that they love outdoors is that it really is a great college prep program. You know what I mean? Like I just think if you want to build young people that are confident, resilient, because when you talk to the families that we know, all the families we know, and we say, what's the top priority for your kids? They say, I want them to be resilient, I want them to be empathetic, I want them to be collaborative, I want them to be a good human. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying, well, you know what we need to do? Less sports, more outdoors. I just know outdoor spaces, they automatically build those elements of what we want. We want to build healthier communities. So we take outdoors, and it's less about the adventure and the swashbuckling and it's us against nature, and much more about those things we want for our families, ourselves, our communities, a long-term goal, because I do think it's a tool for that. And I think that if we position it differently, right, then we're going to get more people that will lean into it, because that's an opportunity that we really want, right? I'm not trying to suffer. Right, that's not my goal. I'm not signing and paying for it necessarily, and we may be challenged in those outdoor experiences, but I do think that it is much more about the ways that it serves our families and communities, and less about the adventurous thing that happens than we actually know.
Well, I love that. My daughter's going to probably want your number later, because once I encourage her to do this, I have some teens in my life. They might say, you weren't talking this spicy this morning when you left, so you never know. Let's talk a little bit about resources, because one of the things I know we've talked about in terms of engaging people and trying to get people to try this and trying to help sort of model and encourage people to get involved, eventually comes to the point where they want to do this and they want to get out and they want to actually try. And Asha, you spoke really beautifully about your experience helping someone get access to equipment so that they could see if this was for them. Can we talk about some of the resources that are available to help once you've gotten past sort of that mental barrier of, I want to try this?
A program that one of the best programs actually out there is the ICANN program. I think ICANN is a really good program. It's limited, and I'll just say ICANN Camp is one of the ones, but I think when you want to get started, what they offer, and I believe that they're doing this year, I think we've been pushing for this, is that they will have leaders from communities of color that come from the communities we live in who lead families on entry-level trips. What they do is they take care of all the equipment, they take care of the reservation, they organize the food, they do all those elements, and they let the family have the small experience of learning that early parts of the progression to actually go camping. And they facilitate that, and they help you start building a skills progression. And I think that's one of them that I really lean on a lot. The Loppet Foundation, so Melanin in Motion partners with the Loppet Foundation around mountain biking, snowboarding, cross-country skiing, like that set of active programs. And that's another program that you can get engaged in. And again, cost will never be the issue in terms of participation. Mm-hmm. But we're doing the same thing. We're cultivating young Black, brown women and women identifying coaches that are leading programs for people who are geographically focused in North Minneapolis, that are focused on girls and women 12 to 18, that are looking at really Black and Indigenous and PLC communities, and in certain parts. But it's you can call those organizations, and they have entry to programs that solve location, equipment, coaching, and cost, and really do all those things in a way, and they do it in a way. There's two parts of the progression I think we're talking about. There's skills progression, in terms of it. And then there's experiential progression, right? Meaning that it can start in your backyard. That's right, and you can do that progression as well. And I think those are great programs. The YMCA, of course, in terms of programming, is a great option, and they also have a commitment that cost will never be the option that you, or the reason you don't participate in a program that they offer. And they offer a tremendous range of outdoor activities.
Asha, any resources to share?
Yeah, we partnered with Wilderness Inquiry this year to do some affinity trips. So we have done BIPOC family, we're doing BIPOC adult. We just came back from the queer adult trip, and then there was a BIPOC adult base camp trip. So far, those have all been going really well, and they're led by the people with whom the affinity is centered around. So that's one. The BIPOC Outdoors Facebook page is a great place for Black, Indigenous, and people of color who live in the Twin Cities to join and find out about things going on. I would say this summer there was probably 5 things every week that were happening across the Twin Cities that were led by and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The Fusion Outdoors Facebook page also has events and ideas that are posted that are more expansive, reaching a wider audience. And I don't know, just like Anthony and I are out in community all the time. So
and I forgot our own. So if you this summer, Slow Roll MSP for all things related to biking, and of course Melanin in Motion, and that is really focused on set of progression around winter. So it's just about to pick up, but that one is very focused on winter activities.
Anthony, you just got me to start thinking about outside. Now you got to go outside in the cold. All right, I'm almost sold. I'm at like a solid 80% now, which is that's growth. Okay, I want to ask really quickly, Anthony. You mentioned earlier that being outdoors is primarily a social space. Can you explain what you mean by a social space?
What I mean is, and actually I think the way I talk about it is, I think being outdoors, whether we talk about biking, camping, those different activities, I think that they're fundamentally social pursuits, that we tend to do them in our social circles. The problem in America is that we live a socially segregated life, that really the long-lasting aspect of redlining and segregation and the way that we organize housing is and just racism generally is that people live in separate communities, and so we don't intermix very well in life, maybe at work, but Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. And I think the second most segregated time is Saturday morning. So it's just this thing where until we are able to move past the social segregation that we just live on a daily basis, we're not able to get the benefit of many of the families that actually are our allies. They are, because we don't really socialize together. We don't really share in a generous and social and kind of beneficial way because the social segregation continues.
Asha, anything to add?
I met my fishing life through BIPOC Outdoors programming, and I've just met a lot of really amazing people, hundreds of people that are, Black, Indigenous, and people of color that want to spend time outdoors. Many folks similar to you who are like, I don't want to do this, but I want connection, or I want to, I'm going to try it once and probably never go back. Mm-hmm. That's my fishing life, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? So I absolutely feel that for me, my social needs were filled to the top of the cup, overflowing, like during, not shelter in place, but whatever that time was right afterwards. It's just, when you're outdoors moving your body and you're with people that you feel safe and comfortable and like held by, it goes to Dudley's line about just like the improvement of mental health, right? BIPOC Outdoors I feel like is a really good antidepressant for me.
I like the sound of that. So let's talk really quickly about just simple things. If you're out here and you're like me and and outdoors is like a great idea. You just haven't really pushed yourself out there. Can you talk to us about, really essentially like baby steps? Help us get out in nature more. Help us go genuinely outside and in sort of simple ways to say, okay, I'm out in nature today, and that feels good.
You know what, we live in, I don't think there is another major community that has more parks per square mile than our communities. And so that move from your house to the park is an amazing beginning. It's gonna be short, it's gonna be close, it's a space you know. That's a really easy beginning for everything. And I love the space from your garden. So from your house to the garden, garden to the park, I mean, that's like, there's so much that can happen between that space. You could do immeasurable things. But I think the thing that I'll add, and I kind of said I like outdoors, nature, and adventure. I think that one of the opportunities I think that we actually love is adventure. But I want to define adventure as just a commitment to any experience that has an unknown outcome. It is not high adventure. It's just, so when we set ourselves up for adventure, where we commit to something, where you commit to let someone else design that walk for you, like that's the beginning. And that adventure, I don't know what it's going to lead to, and you don't either, but that unknown outcome creates an opportunity for growth. And I think the one thing, matter of fact, I'll borrow from Wilderness Inquiry. Wilderness Inquiry is an amazing organization. Something they do almost better than any organization I've ever worked with is that they push you to do a reflection at the end of an experience of how you were impacted by it. It's really subtle, right? But remember talking about Dudley, I said he's built up that bank of positive emotional experience. Mm-hmm. When you go through an experience, whatever it is, the walk to the park, the gardening, taking that moment to just reflect on the difference of how your body feels, the difference of how your energy feels, the difference of how your spirit feels, will help you realize that what you just did was beneficial. It was easy, it was a dose, and it made a significant difference in how you feel. So, that idea is really monumental in terms of really getting the benefit of something we see as small. But that's where you can start with that, any experience and a reflection. Add that to everything you do.
Absolutely. Asha, we have a couple more minutes. I definitely want to hear from you.
Yeah. Well, I agree with what Anthony's saying of like, and really just like validating that like, going outside on your deck, going to your garden, that's spending time outdoors. That's all valid, right? Mm-hmm. My next door neighbor, he'll take a walk when he's on a Zoom call because he's like, nobody wants to see my face. I just get on my call and I just walk around the neighborhood. And it's like, that's outdoors, right? Like, I try and take meetings outdoors. I've took one from the middle of a canoe. I've fished during a Zoom meeting and had my little video going down on the sand on the beach and just fished and listened and and so it's like finding the time but also knowing even if it's like back to back things, taking 30 seconds to open a window or to pop your head outside to just like to get a change of pace and to like just reconnect with yourself, reconnect with your environment around you. And it's like we don't need you like going up to the Boundary Waters for 4 nights and 5 days was great and exhausting. And like, going to my closest city park or regional park, right, for half an hour, 20 minutes, whatever, like that's totally worth it.
So before we close, I really want to make sure that we have an opportunity to ask, how can we support you in your work?
Give money. No. I think everything needs the energy of financial support. So find an organization that is doing this work and support them vigorously, is what I would say. Like that, but like regularly. And the other thing is really find someone in your life who you can gain their trust and help them get outdoors. Like actively support them being outdoors. And that may be inviting them to go with us, and it may be going with them. But actively support them around the goals that matter most to them, not that matter most to you.
Asha?
I think one of the ways is for folks who have historically been at, the ski places and at the mountain bike trails and whatever, is when you see new faces, step aside and make room and really be intentional about how you're speaking to folks and any assumptions that you're making, right? You don't need to ask somebody, like, where did you get that bike? It doesn't look like you could afford that bike, right? Like, just say, hey, have a good ride, you know, or whatever. So really being intentional with your words, and yeah, like Anthony said, finding somebody that you can trust. And yes, we'll take any money available.
I will echo that. Donate to them and their fine organizations that do this work. Well, unfortunately, we have to close it there. My guests for today's special In Focus at the State Fair were Anthony Taylor, an outdoor equity expert who's worked in many official and unofficial roles to connect BIPOC communities to the playground that is Minnesota's nature areas. And also with us has been Asha Shofner, another outdoor equity advocate who founded both the BIPOC Outdoors Twin Cities Facebook group and Fit In Where You Get In Outdoors, which is an intentional group to help underrepresented groups feel at home and welcome in outdoor spaces. She also works for St. Paul as an environmental and outdoor education coordinator. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and mark your calendars for the next In Focus, which will happen October 19th, when we will talk about access to voting. Have an excellent day.